The Muqaddimah Chapter V Part 2. 19. The crafts recede from cities that are close to ruin. This is because of what we have explained. The crafts can improve only when they are needed and when they are in demand with many people. When the condition of a city weakens and senility sets in as the result of a decrease of its civilization and the small number of its inhabitants, luxury in the city decreases and its inhabitants revert to restricting themselves to the necessities. The crafts belonging to luxury conditions and which depend on luxury become few. The master of a particular craft is no longer assured of making a living from it. Therefore, he deserts his craft for another, or he dies and leaves no successor. As a result, the institutions of the crafts disappear altogether. Thus, for instance, painters, goldsmiths, calligraphers, copyists, and similar artisans who cater to luxury needs disappear. The crafts continue to decrease, as long as the city continues to decrease, until they no longer exist. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 96. 20. The Arabs, of all people, are least familiar with crafts. The 97 reason for this is that the Arabs are more firmly rooted in desert life and more remote from sedentary civilization, the crafts, and the other things which sedentary civilization calls for, than anybody else. On the other hand, the known Arabs in the East and the Christian nations along the shores of the Mediterranean are very well versed in the crafts, because they are more deeply rooted in sedentary civilization and more remote from the desert and desert civilization than others. They do not even have camels, which make it possible for the Arabs to retreat far into the wilderness of the desert, nor do they have pastures for camels, or sand suitable for their breeding. 98. Therefore, we find that the homelands of the Arabs and the places they took possession of in Islam had few crafts altogether, so that crafts had to be imported from other regions. One may observe the great number of crafts in non-Arab countries such as China, India, the lands of the Turks, and the Christian nations, and the fact that other nations imported their own crafts from them. The non-Arabs in the West, the Berbers, are like the Arabs in this respect, because for a very long period they remained firmly rooted in desert life. This is attested by the small number of cities in the Berber region, as we have stated before. 99. The crafts in the Maghrib, therefore, are few in number and are not well established. Exceptions are the weaving of wool and the tanning and stitching of leather. For, when they settled down, they developed these crafts greatly, because they were matters of general concern and the wool and leather needed for them were the most common raw materials in their region, on account of the Bedouin conditions prevailing among them. On the other hand, the crafts had been firmly rooted in the East for a very long period, ever since the rule of the ancient nations, the Persians, the Nabateans, the Copts, the Israelites, the Greeks, and the Romans, Rum. Thus, the conditions of sedentary culture became firmly rooted among them. It included the crafts, as we have stated before. Their traces have not been wiped out. The Yemen, Al-Bahrain, Oman, and the Jazirah have long been in Arab possession, but for thousands of years, the rule of these areas has belonged to different Arab nations in succession. They also founded cities and towns there, and promoted the development of sedentary culture and luxury to the highest degree. Among such nations were the Ad and the Thamud, the Amalekites and the Himyar after them, the Tubbas, and the other South Arabian rulers, Adwa. There was a long period of royal authority and sedentary culture. The coloring of sedentary culture established itself firmly. The crafts became abundant and firmly rooted. They were not wiped out simultaneously with each ruling dynasty, as we have stated. They have remained and have always renewed themselves down to this time, and they have become the specialty of that area. Such special Yemenite crafts are embroidered fabrics, striped cloth, and finely woven garments and silks. 100 God inherits the earth and whomever is upon it. (21) The person who has gained the habit of a particular craft is rarely able afterwards to master another. A 101 tailor, for instance, who has acquired the habit of tailoring and knows it well and has that habit firmly rooted in his soul, will not afterwards master the habit of carpentry or construction, unless the first habit was not yet firmly established and its coloring not yet firmly rooted. The reason for this is that habits are qualities and colors of the soul. They do not come all at once. A person who is still in his natural state has an easier time acquiring certain habits and is better prepared to gain them. When the soul has been colored by a habit, it is no longer in its natural state, and it is less prepared to master another habit, because it has taken on a certain coloring from that habit. As a result, it is less disposed to accept another habit. This is clear and attested by the facts of existence. One rarely finds a craftsman who, knowing his craft well, afterwards acquires a good knowledge of another craft and masters both equally well. This extends even to scholars whose habit has to do with thinking. The scholar, who has acquired the habit of one particular science and masters it completely, will rarely achieve the same mastery of the habit of another science, and if he were to study another science, he would, except under very rare circumstances, be deficient in it. The reason lies in the significance attaching, as we have mentioned, to preparedness and the fact that he becomes colored by the color that the soul receives from the habit it acquires. And God knows better. 22. A brief enumeration of the basic crafts. It 102 should be known that the crafts practiced by the human species are numerous, because so much labor is continually available in civilization. They are so numerous as to defy complete enumeration. However, some of them are necessary in civilization or occupy a noble position, because of their object. We shall single these two kinds out for mention and leave all others. Necessary crafts are agriculture, architecture, tailoring, carpentry, and weaving. Crafts noble because of their object are midwifery, the art of writing, book production, singing, and medicine. Midwifery is something necessary in civilization and a matter of general concern, because it assures, as a rule, the life of the newborn child. The object of midwifery is newborn children and their mothers. Medicine preserves the health of man and repels disease. It is a branch of physics. Its object is the human body. The art of writing, and book production, which depends on it, preserve the things that are of concern to man and keep them from being forgotten. It enables the innermost thoughts of the soul to reach those who are far and absent. 103 It perpetuates in books the results of thinking and scholarship. It makes 104 out of the 3 orders of existence, as it constitutes a special order of existence, for ideas. Singing is the harmony of sounds and the manifestation of their beauty to the ears. All these 3 crafts call for contact with great rulers in their privacy and at their intimate parties. Thus, they have nobility that other crafts do not have. The other crafts are, as a rule, secondary and subordinate. The attitude toward them, however, differs according to the different purposes and requirements. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 105. 23 The craft of agriculture. 106. The fruit of this craft is the obtainment of foodstuffs and grains. People must undertake to stir the earth, sow, cultivate the plants, see to it that they are watered and that they grow until they reach their full growth, then, harvest the ears, and get the grain out of the husks. They also must understand all the related activities, and procure all the things required in this connection. Agriculture is the oldest of all crafts, inasmuch as it provides the food that is the main factor in perfecting human life, since man can exist without anything else but not without food. Therefore, this craft has existed especially in the desert, since, as we have stated before, it is prior to and older than sedentary life. 107 Thus, it became a Bedouin craft which is not practiced or known by sedentary people. Because all their conditions are secondary to those of desert life and their crafts, thus, secondary and subsequent to Bedouin crafts. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 108. 24 The waft of architecture. This is the first and oldest craft of sedentary civilization. It is the knowledge of how to go about using houses and mansions for cover and shelter. 109 This is because man has the natural disposition to reflect upon the outcome of things. Thus, it is unavoidable that he must reflect upon how to avert the harm arising from heat and cold by using houses which have walls and roofs to intervene between him and those things on all sides. This natural disposition to think, which is the real meaning of humanity, exists among men, in different degrees. Some men are more or less temperate in this respect. They use housing with moderation, as, for instance, the inhabitants of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th zones. The inhabitants of the 1st and 7th zones, on the other hand, are unfamiliar with the use of housing, because they are intemperate and their thinking does not go far enough to enable them to practice human crafts. Therefore, they take shelter in caverns and caves, just as they, also, eat unprepared and uncooked food. 110. Now, the temperate people who use houses for shelter become very numerous and have many houses in one area. They become strangers to each other and no longer know each other. They fear surprise attacks at night. Therefore, they must protect their community by surrounding it with a wall to guard them. The whole thing thus becomes a single town or city in which they are guarded by authorities which keep them apart. 111 They, also, need protection against the enemy. Thus, they use fortresses and castles for themselves and for the people under their control. These men, who control fortresses and castles, are like rulers or emirs or tribal chieftains of a corresponding position. Also, building conditions are different in the various towns. Each city follows in this respect the procedure known to and within the technical competence of its inhabitants, and corresponding to the climate and the different conditions of the inhabitants, with regard to wealth and poverty. The situation of the inhabitants within each individual city also differs. Some use castles and far-flung constructions comprising a number of dwellings and houses and rooms, because they have a great number of children, servants, dependents, and followers. They make their walls of stones, which they join together with quicklime. They cover them with paint and plaster, and do the utmost to furnish and decorate everything. They do so, in order to show how greatly they are concerned for their shelter. In addition, they prepare cellars and underground rooms for the storage of their food, and also stables for tying up their horses. 112 If they are army people and have many followers and guests, such as emirs and people of a corresponding position. Others build a small dwelling or house for themselves and for their children to live in. Their desire goes no farther, because their situation permits them no more. Thus, they restrict themselves to a mere shelter, which is natural to human beings. Between the two extremes, there are innumerable degrees. Architecture is also needed when rulers and people of a dynasty build large towns and high monuments, hayakil. They try their utmost to make good plans and build tall structures with technical perfection, so that architecture can reach its highest development. Architecture is the craft that satisfies requirements in all these respects. It is found most widely represented in the temperate zones, that is, in the fourth zone and the adjacent area. In the intemperate zones, there is no building activity. The people there use enclosures of reeds and clay as houses, or take shelter in caverns and caves. 113. The architects who exercise the craft differ. Some are intelligent and skillful. Others are inferior. Furthermore, architecture has many subdivisions. Thus, the building material may be smoothed 114 stones or bricks. 115 The walls made of such material are joined and firmly held together by clay and quicklime. They thus hold together as fast as if they were of one piece. Another material is simply earth. One builds walls with it by using 116 two wooden boards, the measurements of which vary according to local custom. The average measurements are 4 cubits by 2. They are set upon a foundation. The distance between them depends on the width of the foundation the builder considers appropriate. They are joined together with pieces of wood fastened 117 with ropes or twine. The two remaining sides of the empty space between the two boards are joined by 2 other small boards. Then, one puts earth mixed with quicklime into this frame. The earth and quicklime are pounded with special mixers used only for this purpose, until everything is well mixed throughout. Earth is then added a second and third time, until the space between the two boards is filled. The earth and quicklime have combined and become one substance. Then, 2 other boards are set up in the same fashion, and the earth is treated in the same manner, until it is ready. All the boards 118 are then properly set up piece upon piece, until the whole wall is set up and joined together as tightly as if it were of one piece. This construction is called tabiya, 119, and the builder of it is called tawab. Another technique of construction is the covering of walls with quicklime. The quicklime is first diluted with water and let soak for a week or 2 depending on how long is required for it to become well balanced in its temper and to lose any excess igneousness detrimental to its adhesiveness. When this process is completed to the satisfaction of the builder, he puts it on the wall beginning at the top and rubs it in until it sticks. Another technique of construction is roofing. Pieces of wood, beams, either carefully smoothed by a carpenter or left rough, are placed over 2 walls of the house, and more boards are placed on top of them. They are joined together with nails. Upon that, earth and quicklime are poured. They are pounded with mixers until they combine and hold together. The roof is thus covered with quicklime, plaster, exactly as the walls were covered with it. Another technique of construction is decoration and ornamentation. Thus, figures formed from gypsum are placed upon the walls. The gypsum is mixed with water, and then solidified again, with some humidity remaining in it. Symmetrical figures are chiseled out of it with iron drills, until it looks brilliant and pleasant. The walls are occasionally also covered with pieces of marble, brick, clay, shells, mother of pearl, or jet. 120. The material may be divided either into identically shaped or differently shaped pieces. These pieces are arranged in whatever symmetrical figures and arrangements are being utilized by the various artisans, and set into the quicklime, with which the walls have been covered. Thus, the walls come to look like colorful flower beds. There are other techniques of construction, such as the construction of wells and cisterns for running water. In the houses, large, well-cut marble basins are prepared. They have orifices in the middle to permit the water of the cistern to flow out. The water comes to the cistern from the outside through conduits bringing it into the houses. There are other similar kinds of architectural activity. The workmen who do all these things differ in skill and intelligence. They grow in number when the civilization of a town increases and widens. The authorities often have recourse to the opinions of these men, about construction matters which they understand better. For in towns with large populations, people live in very crowded conditions. Therefore, they compete with each other for space and air above and below and for the use of the outside of a building. The owner fears lest any encroachment cause damage 121 to the walls, and, therefore, forbids it to his neighbor, except where the neighbor has a legal right to it. People also have differences over right-of way and about outlets for running water and about refuse disposed of through subterranean conduits. Occasionally, someone claims somebody else's right to use of a wall, eaves, or a gutter, 122 because the houses are so close to each other. Or someone may claim that his neighbor's wall is in bad condition and he fears that it will collapse. He needs a judgment against the other party from an expert 123 to force the other party to tear the wall down and prevent damage to the neighboring house. Or, a house or courtyard has to be divided between two parties, so that no damage to the house or curtailment of its usefulness is caused, and similar things. All these matters are clear only to those who know architecture in all its details. They can judge these details by looking at the joints and ties and the wooden parts. 124, they can see whether the walls are leaning over or are straight, whether dwellings are divided as required by their construction and intended use, and whether water can flow in and out the conduits without causing harm to the houses or walls it flows through, and other things. They know about them and have the experience that others do not have. However, the quality of architects differs in the different groups. It depends on the ruling dynasties and their power. We have stated before 125 that the perfection of the crafts depends on the perfection of sedentary culture, and their extent depends on the number of those who demand them. At the beginning, the dynasty is a Bedouin one, and therefore needs for its construction activities the help of other regions. This was the case when Al-Walid b. Abd al-Malik decided to build the mosques of Medina and Jerusalem and his own mosque in Damascus. He sent to the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople for workmen skilled in construction work, and the Byzantine Emperor sent him enough men to build these mosques as he had planned them. 126. Architects also make some use of geometry, engineering. For instance, they use the plumb to make walls perpendicular, and they use devices for lifting water, to make it flow, and similar things. Thus, they must know something about the problems connected with engineering. They also must know how to move heavy loads with the help of machines. Big blocks of large stones cannot be lifted into place on a wall by the unaided strength of workmen alone. Therefore, the architect must contrive to multiply the strength of the rope by passing it through holes, constructed according to geometrical proportions, of the attachments called mickle. Pulleys. 127. They make the load easier to lift, so that the intended work can be completed without difficulty. This can be achieved only with the help of geometrical, engineering, principles which are commonly known among men. Such things made it possible to build the ancient monuments that are standing to this day. They are believed to have been built in pre-Islamic times and by persons whose bodies were of a size corresponding to the large size of the monuments. This is not so. The people who built them used engineering devices, as we have mentioned 128. This should be understood. God creates whatever He wishes. 129. 25. The craft of carpentry. This craft is one of the necessities of civilization. Its material is wood. This is as follows: God made all created things useful for man, so as to supply his necessities and needs. Trees belong among these things. They have innumerable uses known to everybody. One of their uses is their use as wood when they are dry. The first use of wood is as wood for fires, which man needs to live, as sticks for support, protection, of flocks, and other necessities, and as supports for loads that one fears might topple over. After that, wood has other uses, for the inhabitants of the desert as well as for those of settled areas. Bedouins use wood for tent poles and pegs, for camel litters for their women, and for the lances, bows, and arrows they use for weapons. Sedentary people use wood for the roofs of their houses, for the locks of their doors, and for chairs to sit on. Wood is the raw material for all these things. The particular form needed in each case is the result of craftsmanship. The craft concerned with that and which gives every wooden object its form is carpentry in all its different grades. The master of this craft must first split the wood into smaller pieces or into boards 130. Then he puts these pieces together in the required form. In this connection, he attempts with the aid of his craft to prepare these pieces by the proper arrangement for their becoming parts of the desired particular shape. The man in charge of this craft is the carpenter. He is necessary to civilization. Then, when sedentary culture increases and luxury makes its appearance and people want to use elegant types of roofs, doors, chairs, and furniture, these things come to be produced in a most elegant way through mastery of remarkable techniques which are luxuries and in no way necessities. Such techniques include, for instance, the use of carvings for doors and chairs. Or, one skillfully turns and shapes pieces of wood in a lathe, and then one puts these pieces together in certain symmetrical arrangements and nails them together, so that they appear to the eye to be of one piece. They consist of different shapes all symmetrically combined. This is done with all the possible shapes into which wood may be cut, which turn out to be very elegant things. The same applies to all wooden utensils, allat, of whatever kind. Carpentry is also needed for the construction of ships, which are made of boards and nails. Ships are bodies, constructed with the help of geometry, engineering, fashioned after the form of a fish and the way a fish swims in the water with its fins and belly. The shape is intended to make it easier for the ship to brave the water. Instead of the animal motion that the fish has, the ship is moved by the winds. It is often supported by the movement of oars, as is the case in naval fleets. In view of its origin, carpentry needs a good deal of geometry of all kinds. It requires either a general or a specialized knowledge of proportion and measurement, in order to bring the forms of things from potentiality into actuality in the proper manner, and for the knowledge of proportions one must have recourse to the geometrician. Therefore, the leading Greek geometricians were all master carpenters. Euclid, 131, the author of the Book of the Principles, on geometry, was a carpenter and was known as such. The same was the case with Apollonius, the author of the book on conic sections, and Menelaus, 132 and others. It is said that Noah taught carpentry, first, in the world. With its help, he constructed the ship of salvation, the ark, with which he performed his prophetical miracle 133 during the flood. This story may be possible, that is, Noah may have been a carpenter. However, there is no reliable proof that he was the first to practice carpentry, because the event lies so far back in the past. The story serves to indicate the great age of carpentry. There is no sound information about its existence before the story of Noah. Therefore, he was, in a way, considered the first to learn it. The true secrets, significance, of the crafts in the world should be understood. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 134. 26. The craft of weaving and tailoring. It 135 should be known that people who are temperate in their humanity cannot avoid giving some thought to keeping warm, as they do to shelter. One manages to keep warm by using woven material as protective cover against both heat and cold. This requires the interlacing of yarn, until it turns out to be a complete garment. This is spinning and weaving. Desert people restrict themselves to this. But people who are inclined toward sedentary culture cut the woven material into pieces of the right size to cover the form of the body and all of its numerous limbs in their various locations. They then put the different pieces together with thread, until they turn out to be a complete garment that fits the body and can be worn by people. The craft that makes things fit is tailoring. These two crafts are necessary in civilization, because human beings must keep warm. The purpose of weaving is to weave wool and cotton yarn in warp and woof and do it well, so that the texture will be strong. Pieces of cloth of certain measurements are thus produced. Some are garments of wool for covering. Others are garments of cotton and linen for wear. The purpose of tailoring is to give the woven material a certain form in accordance with the many different shapes and customs that may occur in this connection. The material is first cut with scissors into pieces that fit the limbs of the body. The pieces are then joined together with the help of skillful tailoring according to the rules, either by the use of thread, or with bands, or 1. Quilts them, or cuts openings. 136. This craft is restricted to sedentary culture, since the inhabitants of the desert can dispense with it. They merely cover themselves with cloth. The tailoring of clothes, the cutting, fitting, and sewing of the material, is one of the various methods and aspects of sedentary culture. This should be understood, in order to understand the reason why the wearing of sewn garments is forbidden on the pilgrimage. According to the religious law, the pilgrimage requires, among other things, the discarding of all worldly attachments and the return to God as He created us in the beginning. Man should not set his heart upon any of his luxury customs, such as perfume, women, sewn garments, or boots. He should not go hunting or expose himself to any other of the customs with which his soul and character have become colored. When he dies, he will necessarily lose them, anyhow. He should come to the pilgrimage, as if he were going to the Last Judgment, humble in his heart, sincerely devoted to his Lord. If he is completely sincere in this respect, his reward will be that he will shed his sins, and be, like he was on the day when his mother gave birth to him. Praised be you! How kind have you been with your servants, and how compassionate have you been with them in their search for guidance toward you. These two crafts are very ancient in the world, because it is necessary for man in a temperate civilization to keep warm. The inhabitants of less temperate, hotter zones do not need to keep warm. Therefore, we hear that the Negro inhabitants of the first zone are mostly naked. Because of the great age of these crafts, they are attributed by the common people to Idris, the most ancient of the prophets. 137. They are also often attributed to Hermes. 138. Hermes is said to be identical with Idris. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 139. 27. The craft of midwifery. Midwifery is a craft that shows how to proceed in bringing the newborn child gently out of the womb of his mother and how to prepare the things that go with that. It also shows what is good for a newborn child after it is born, as we shall mention. The craft is as a rule restricted to women, since they, as women, may see the pudenda of other women. The woman who exercises this craft is called midwife, Kabbalah, literally, the woman who receives. The word implies the meaning of giving and receiving. The woman in labor in a way gives the embryo to the midwife, and the latter receives it. This is as follows: when the embryo has gone through all its stages 140 and is completely and perfectly formed in the womb, the period God determined for its remaining in the womb is as a rule 9 months, it seeks to come out, because God implanted such a desire in unborn children. But the opening is too narrow for it, and it is difficult for the embryo to come out. It often splits one of the walls of the vagina by its pressure, and often the close connection and attachment of its covering membranes with the uterus are ruptured. All this is painful and hurts very much. This is the meaning of labor pains. In this connection, the midwife may offer some succor by massaging the back, the buttocks, and the lower extremities adjacent to the uterus. She thus stimulates the activity of the force, pushing the embryo out, and facilitates the difficulties encountered in this connection as much as she can. She uses as much strength as she thinks is required by the difficulty of the process. When the embryo has come out, it remains connected with the uterus by the umbilical cord at its stomach, through which it was fed. That cord is a superfluous special limb for feeding the child. The midwife cuts it but so that she does not go beyond the place where it starts to be superfluous and does not harm the stomach of the child or the uterus of the mother. She then treats the place of the operation with cauterization or whatever other treatment she sees fit. When the embryo comes out of that narrow opening with its humid bones that can easily be bent and curved, it may happen that its limbs and joints change their shape, because they were only recently formed and because the substances, of which it consists, are humid. Therefore, the midwife undertakes to massage and correct the newborn child, until every limb has resumed its natural shape and the position destined for it, and the child has again its normal form. After that, she goes back to the woman in labor and massages and kneads her, so that the membranes of the embryo may come out. They are sometimes somewhat late in coming out. On such an occasion, it is feared that the constricting power, muscle, might resume its natural position before all the membranes are brought out. They are superfluities. They might become putrid, and their putridity might enter the uterus, which could be fatal. The midwife takes precautions against that. She tries to stimulate the ejection, until the membranes which are late in coming out come out, too. She then returns to the child. She anoints its limbs with oils and dusts it with astringent powders, to strengthen it and to dry up the fluids of the uterus. She smears something upon the child's palate to lift its uvula. She puts something into its nose, in order to empty the cavities of its brain. She makes it gargle with swallow, and electuary, in order to prevent its bowels from becoming obstructed and their walls from sticking together. Then, she treats the woman in labor for the weakness caused by the labor pains and the pain that the separation causes her uterus. Although the child is no natural limb of the mother, still, the way it is created in the uterus causes it to become attached to the body of the mother, as if it were an inseparable limb of her body. Therefore, its separation causes a pain similar to that caused by the amputation of a limb. The midwife also treats the pain of the vagina that was torn and wounded by the pressure of the child coming out. All these are ills with the treatment of which midwives are better acquainted than anyone else. We likewise find them better acquainted than a skillful physician with the means of treating the ills affecting the bodies of little children from the time they are sucklings until they are weaned. This is simply because the human body, at this stage, is only potentially a human body. After the child is weaned, its body becomes actually a human one. Then, its need for a physician is greater than its need for a midwife. One can see that this craft is necessary to the human species and civilization. Without it, the individuals of the species could not, as a rule, come into being. Some individuals of the species may be able to dispense with this craft. God may arrange it for them that way as a miracle and extraordinary wonder. This, for instance, may be done for the prophets. Or there may be some instinct and guidance given to the child through instinct and natural disposition. Thus, such children may come into existence without the help of midwives. The miraculous kind of births has often occurred. It has, thus, been reported that the prophet was born with the umbilical cord cut and circumcised, placing his hands upon the earth and turning his eyes toward heaven. The same applies to Jesus, who spoke, in the cradle, 141 and other things. The instinctive kind of births is not unknown. Since dumb animals, such as, for instance, bees and others 142 have remarkable instincts, why should one not assume the same for man who is superior to them, and especially for those human beings who are singled out by acts of divine grace? Furthermore, the common instinct of newborn children that causes them to seek their mother's breast is a clear testimony to the existence of an instinct in them. The ways of divine foresight are too great to be grasped completely. This explains the incorrectness of the opinion of Al-Farabi and the Spanish philosophers. They argue for the non-existence of, the possibility, of a destruction of the various species, of beings, and the impossibility of an end of created things, especially of the human species. They say that once there has been an end to, the existence of, individuals of, the human species, a later existence of them would be impossible. Their existence depends upon the existence of midwifery, without which man could not come into being, since even if we were to assume that a child might come into existence, without the help of this craft and without being taken care of by this craft, until it was weaned, still it could certainly not survive. For not only midwifery but also other crafts are needed. However, the crafts cannot possibly exist without the ability to think, because they are the fruit of thinking and depend on it. Avicenna undertook the refutation of this opinion. Because he was opposed to it and admitted the possibility of an end of the various species, of beings, and of the destruction of the world of creation and its subsequent re-establishment as a consequence of astronomical requirements and strange, astral, positions which, he thought, take place rarely over very long intervals of time. It requires the fermentation, with the help of appropriate heat, of a kind of clay that corresponds to the temper of, the being to be created. Thus, it comes to be a human being. Then, an animal is destined for that human being. In that animal, an instinctive desire is created, which is directed toward bringing that human being up and being kind to him, until he exists fully and is weaned. Avicenna explained this lengthily in the treatise which he entitled the Treatise of Hayib. Yaxon 143. His argumentation is not correct. We agree with him in regard to the possibility of the end of the various species of beings, but not on the basis of his arguments. His argumentation depends on relating actions to a cause that makes them necessary. The theory of the voluntary agent 144 is a proof against him. According to the theory of the voluntary agent, there is no intermediary between the actions and the primeval power, and there is no need for such a difficult task. If we accepted Avicenna's argumentation, for the sake of the argument, we might say that it is saying no more than that the continued existence of the individual is the consequence of the instinctive desire to bring him up which has been created in dumb animals. What, then, would be the necessity that might call for such a procedure, and further, if such an instinctive desire can be created in a dumb animal, what would prevent its creation in the child itself, as we, for our part, assumed at the beginning? It is more likely that an instinct directed toward his own interests is created in an individual than that one directed toward the interests of someone else is created in someone. Thus, both theories, that of Al-Farabi and that of Avicenna, prove themselves wrong in their particular approach, as I have established. God is the Creator, the Knowing One. 145. 28. The craft of medicine. 146. The craft of medicine is needed in settled areas and cities but not in the desert. This craft is necessary in towns and cities because of its recognized usefulness. Its fruit is the preservation of health among those who are healthy, and the repulsion of illness among those who are ill, with the help of medical treatment, until they are cured of their illnesses. It should be known that the origin of all illnesses is in food, as Muhammad said in the comprehensive tradition on medicine, that is reported among physicians but suspected by the religious scholars. 147. He said, the stomach is the home of disease. Dieting is the main medicine. The origin of every disease is indigestion. The statement the stomach is the home of disease is obvious. The statement dieting is the main medicine is to be understood in the sense that dieting means going hungry, since hunger means refraining, idima, from food. Thus, the meaning is that hunger is the greatest medicine, the origin of all medicines. The statement, the origin of every disease is indigestion, is to be understood in the sense that barada indigestion is the addition of new food to the food already in the stomach before it has been digested. The statement lends itself to the following comment. God created man and preserves his life through nourishment. He gets it through eating, and he applies to it the digestive and nutritive powers, until it becomes blood fitting for the flesh and bone parts of the body. Then, the growing power takes it over, and it is turned into flesh and bones. Digestion means that the nourishment is boiled by natural heat, stage by stage, until it actually becomes a part of the body. This is to be explained as follows. The nourishment that enters the mouth and is chewed by the jaws undergoes the influence of the heat of the mouth, which boils it slightly. Thus, its composition is slightly altered. This can be observed in a bit of food that is taken and chewed well. Its composition then can be observed to be different from that of the original food. The food then gets into the stomach, and the heat of the stomach boils it, until it becomes chyme, that is, the essence of the boiled food. 148. The stomach sends the chyme on into the liver, and ejects the part of the food that has become solid sediment in the bowels, through the two body openings. The heat of the liver then boils the chyme, until it becomes fresh blood. On it, there swims a kind of foam as the result of the boiling. That foam is yellow bile. Parts of it become dry and solid. They are black bile. The natural heat is not quite sufficient to boil the coarse parts. They are phlegm. The liver then sends all these substances into the veins and arteries. There, the natural heat starts to boil them. The pure blood thus generates a hot and humid vapor that sustains the animal spirit. 149. The growing power acts upon the blood, and it becomes flesh. The thick part of it then becomes bones. Then, the body eliminates the elements of the digested food it does not need as the various superfluities, such as sweat, saliva, mucus, and tears. This is the process of nourishment, and the transformation of food from potential into actual flesh. Now, illnesses originate from fevers, and most illnesses are fevers. The reason for fevers is that the natural heat is too weak to complete the process of boiling in each of those stages. The nourishment thus is not fully assimilated. The reason for that, as a rule, is either that there is a great amount of food in the stomach that becomes too much for the natural heat, or that food is put into the stomach before the first food has been completely boiled. In such a case, the natural heat either devotes itself exclusively to the new food, so that the first food is left in its half-digested state, or it divides itself between the old and the new food, and then is insufficient to boil and assimilate them completely. The stomach sends the food in that state into the liver, and the heat of the liver likewise is not strong enough to assimilate it. Often, an unassimilated superfluity, resulting from food that had been taken in earlier, has, also, remained in the liver. The liver sends all of it to the veins unassimilated, as it is. When the body has received what it properly needs, it eliminates the unassimilated superfluity, together with the other superfluities such as sweat, tears, and saliva, if it can. Often, the body cannot cope with the greater part of the unassimilated superfluity. Thus, it remains in the veins, the liver, and the stomach, and increases with time. Any composite humid substance that is not boiled and assimilated undergoes putrefaction. Consequently, the unassimilated nourishment what is called kilt 150 becomes putrefied. Anything in the process of putrefaction develops a strange heat. This heat is what, in the human body, is called fever. This may be exemplified by food that is left over and eventually becomes putrefied, and by dung that has become putrefied. Heat develops in it and takes its course. This is what fevers in the human body mean. Fevers are the main cause and origin of illness, as was mentioned in the prophetic tradition 151. Such fevers can be cured by not giving an ill person any nourishment for a certain number of weeks, then, he must take the proper nourishment until he is completely cured. In a state of health, the same procedure serves as a preventive treatment for this and other illnesses. 152. Putrefaction may be localized in a particular limb. Then, a disease will develop in that limb, or the body will be affected either in the principal limbs or in others, because that particular limb is ill and its illness produces an illness of its powers. This covers all illnesses. Their origin as a rule is in the nourishment. All this is left to the attention of the physician. The incidence of such illnesses is more frequent among the inhabitants of sedentary areas and cities than elsewhere, because they live a life of plenty. They eat a great deal and rarely restrict themselves to one particular kind of food. They lack caution in taking food, and they prepare their food, when they cook it, with the admixture of a good many things, such as spices, herbs, and fruits, both fresh and dry. They do not restrict themselves in this respect to one or even a few kinds. We have on occasion counted 40 different kinds of vegetables and meats in a single cooked dish. This gives the nourishment a strange temper and often does not agree with the body and its parts. Furthermore, the air in cities becomes corrupt through admixture of putrid vapors because of the great number of superfluities in cities. 153. It is the air that gives energy to the spirit and thus strengthens the influence of the natural heat upon digestion. 154. Furthermore, the inhabitants of cities lack exercise. As a rule, they rest and remain quiet. Exercise has no part in their life, and has no influence upon them. Thus, the incidence of illness is great in towns and cities, and the inhabitants' need for medicine is correspondingly great. On the other hand, the inhabitants of the desert, as a rule, eat little. Hunger prevails among them, because they have little grain. Hunger eventually becomes a custom of theirs which is often thought to be something natural to them because it is so lasting. Of seasonings they have few or none. The preparation of food boiled with spices and fruits is caused by the luxury of sedentary culture with which they have nothing to do. Thus, they take their nourishment plain and without admixtures, and its temper comes close to being agreeable to the body. Their air has little putrescence, because there is little humidity and putrescence when they stay anywhere, and the air is changing when they move around. 2. They take exercise, and there is a lot of movement when they race horses, or go hunting, or search for things they need, or occupy themselves with their needs. For all these reasons, their digestion is very good. There is no adding of new food when the old food has not yet completely been digested. Thus, their temper is healthier and more remote from illness than that of sedentary people. As a result, their need for medicine is small. Therefore, physicians are nowhere to be found in the desert. The only reason for this is the lack of need for them, because if physicians were needed in the desert they would be there. There would then be a livelihood for them to lead them to settle there. This is how God proceeds with his servants. And verily, you will not be able to change God's way. 155. 29. Calligraphy, the art of writing, is one of the human crafts. Writing is the outlining and shaping of letters to indicate audible words which, in turn, indicate what is in the soul. It comes second after oral expression. It is a noble craft, since it is one of the special qualities of man by which he distinguishes himself from the animals. Furthermore, it reveals what is in people's minds. It enables the intention of a person to be carried to distant places, and, thus, the needs of that person may be executed without him personally taking care of them. 156. It enables people to become acquainted with science, learning, with the books of the ancients, and with the sciences and information written down by them. Because of all these useful aspects, writing is a noble craft. The 157 transformation of writing in man from potentiality into actuality takes place through instruction. The quality of writing in a town corresponds to the social organization, civilization, and competition for luxuries among its inhabitants, and the demand for all that, since writing is a craft. We have stated before 158 that the crafts are that way and that they depend on civilization. For this reason, we find that most Bedouins are illiterate. They are not able to read and write. Those of them who do read or write have an inferior handwriting or read haltingly. On the other hand, we find that instruction in handwriting in cities with an extraordinarily developed civilization is more proficient, easier, and methodically better than elsewhere, because the coloring of the craft of writing is firmly established in them. Thus, we are told about contemporary Cairo, Egypt, that there are teachers there who are specialized in the teaching of calligraphy. 159. They teach the pupil by norms and laws how to write each letter. In addition, they let him teach others how to write each letter. This strengthens his respect for the rank of knowledge and for perception as 160 far as teaching is concerned. His habit becomes one of the most perfect kind. This comes from the perfection and abundance of crafts there, the result of large civilization and the great amount of available labor. Writing 161 is not learned that way in Spain and the Maghrib. The letters are not learned individually according to norms the teacher gives to the pupil. Writing is learned by imitating complete words. The pupil repeats these words, and the teacher examines him, until he knows well how to write, and until the habit of writing is at his fingertips. 162. Then, he is called a good calligrapher. Arabic writing had already reached its most developed, accurate, and excellent stage in the Tuba dynasty, because that dynasty had achieved a great sedentary culture and luxury. The handwriting there was called the Himyarite script. Writing was transplanted from South Arabia to Al-Hira, because the dynasty of the family of Al-Mundhir was there. They were relatives of the Tubas and shared their group feeling, and they were the founders of Arab rule in the Iraq. Their writing was not as good as that of the Tubas, because the time between the two dynasties was short. 163 and, therefore, sedentary culture and the crafts and other things depending on it were not developed enough for calligraphy. From Al-Hira, the inhabitants of At-Taif and the Quraysh learned writing, as has been said. The person who learned the art of writing from Al-Hira is said to have been Sufyan b. Umayyah, or Harb b. Umayyah. He learned it from Aslam b. Sidra. 164. This is a possible theory. It is a more likely theory than that of those who say that they learned it from the Iyad, the inhabitants of the Iraq, because of the verse of an Iyadi poet. People to whom belongs the area of the Iraq when they travel together, as well as writing and pen. This is an unlikely theory. Even though the Iyad settled in the area of the Iraq, they maintained their desert attitude, and handwriting is a sedentary craft. The meaning of the verse of that poet is that the Iyad were closer to handwriting and the pen than other Arabs, because they were closer to an urban environment. The theory that the inhabitants of the Hijaz learned writing from the inhabitants of Al-Hira, who, in turn, had learned it from the Tubas and the Himyar, is the most plausible one. In 165, the biography of one of Milik's companions, Ibn Farrukh Abdallah b. Farrukh al-Kairawani al-Farisi al-Andalusi, 166 in the Kitab at-Takmila of Ibn Alabar, I have seen the following remark, reported by Ibn Farrukh on the authority of Abdar Rahman b. Ziyad b. Anum, 167 on the authority of his father, who said, I said to Abdallah b. Abbas, you Qurayshites, tell me about the Arabic script. Did you use it in the same way, before God sent Muhammad, with its connected and unconnected letters, such as L, M, N? Ibn Abbas replied, yes. I continued, from whom did you learn it? He replied, from Harb b. Umayyah. I asked, from whom did Harb learn it? He replied, from Abdallah b. Jud'in. I asked, from whom did Abdallah b. Jud'in learn it? He replied, from the inhabitants of Al-Anbir. I asked, from whom did they learn it? He replied, from a Yemenite newcomer among them. I asked, from whom did he learn it? He replied, from Al-Kulajan 168b. Al-Qasim, who wrote down the revelation of the Prophet Hid. He used to say, do you invent a new procedure every year? Or an opinion that is to be explained in a different way? Indeed, death is better than a life in which among those who abuse us. There are the Jurham and the Himyar. End of the quotation from the Kitab at-Takmila of Ibn Alabar. At the end of the passage, Ibn Alabir added, 169 I was told this by Abu Bakr b. Abi Jamra, in his book, on the authority of Abu Bakr b. Al-Asi, 170 on the authority of Abul Walid al-Waqtashi, 171 on the authority of Abu Umar at-Dalamanki, 172 on the authority of Abu Abdallah b. Mufarraj, 173 who was my written source, on the authority of Abu Said b. Yunus, 174 on the authority of Muhammad b. Musa b. An-Nu'man, on the authority of Yahya b. Muhammad b. Kushash, on the authority of Uthman b. Ayub al-Ma'ifari at-Tunisi, on the authority of Burlal b. Ubida at-Tujabai, on the authority of Abdallah b. Farrukh. The Himyarites had a script called Musnad. 175 the letters were written separately. It could be studied only with their permission. The Madar learned the Arabic script from the Himyar. However, they did not write it well, as is the case with crafts practiced in the desert. The crafts there have no firmly established methods and show no inclination toward accuracy and elegance. There is a wide gap between the desert attitude and craftsmanship, and Bedouins can for the most part dispense with crafts. Thus, the writing of the Arabs was a Bedouin script, exactly like, or similar to, the writing the Arab Bedouins use at this time. Or, we might say that the writing the Arab Bedouins use at this time shows a better technique, because the Arab Bedouins today are closer to sedentary culture and have more contact with cities and dynasties than the Madar of old. The Madar were more firmly rooted in desert life and more remote from sedentary areas than the inhabitants of the Yemen, the Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Arabic writing at the beginning of Islam was, therefore, not of the best quality nor of the greatest accuracy and excellence. It was not, even, of medium quality, because the Arabs possessed the savage desert attitude and were not familiar with crafts. One may compare what happened to the orthography of the Quran on account of this situation. The men around Muhammad wrote the Quran in their own script, which was not of a firmly established, good quality. Most of the letters were in contradiction to the orthography required by persons versed in the craft of writing. The Quranic script of the men around Muhammad was then imitated by the men of the second generation, because of the blessing inherent in the use of an orthography that had been used by the men around Muhammad, who were the best human beings after Muhammad himself, and who had received his revelation from the book and word of God. At the present time, people similarly imitate the handwriting of saints or scholars because of the blessing inherent in that, and they follow the orthography whether it be wrong or right. One could hardly compare these men to the men around Muhammad or the things they write down to, the divine revelation, they wrote down. Consequently, the Quranic orthography of the men around Muhammad was followed and became established, and the scholars acquainted with it have called attention to passages where this is noticeable. No attention should be paid in this connection to the assumption of certain incompetent scholars that the men around Muhammad knew well the art of writing and that the alleged discrepancies between their writing and the principles of orthography are not discrepancies, as has been alleged, but have a reason. For instance, they explain the addition of the alif in la adbahaneu I shall indeed slaughter him as an indication that the slaughtering did not take place, la adbahaneu. The addition of the ya in bi'idin with hands, power, they explain as an indication that the divine power is perfect. 176 There are similar things based on nothing but purely arbitrary assumptions. The only reason that caused them to assume such things is their belief that their explanations would free the men around Muhammad from the suspicion of deficiency, in the sense that they were not able to write well. They think that good writing is perfection. Thus, they do not admit the fact that the men around Muhammad were deficient in writing. They want to consider them as perfect by ascribing good writing to them, and they seek to explain orthographic peculiarities that are contrary to good orthographic usage. This is not correct. It should be known that as far as the men around Muhammad are concerned, writing has nothing to do with perfection. Writing is an urban craft that serves to make a living, as has been shown above. 177 Perfection in a craft is something relative. It is not absolute perfection. A deficiency from perfection in the crafts does not essentially affect one's religion or personal qualities. It merely affects things that have to do with making a living, and does so in accordance with the existing civilization and cooperation for civilization, since writing indicates what is in the souls. The Prophet was illiterate. That was perfection so far as he was concerned, and it was in keeping with his station, because he was noble and had nothing to do with the practical crafts, all of which are matters connected with making a living and with civilization. On the other hand, as far as we are concerned, illiteracy is not a perfection. Muhammad was exclusively devoted to his Lord. We, however, must cooperate in order to make life in this world possible for us. The same applies to all the crafts, including even the theoretical 178 sciences. As far as Muhammad is concerned, perfection means that he has nothing to do with any of them. The opposite is the case with us. Later, royal authority came to the Arabs. They conquered cities and took possession of provinces. They settled in al-Basra and al-Kufa, and the dynasty needed the art of writing. At that time, they began writing. 179 They sought to practice and study it, and it came into common use. As a result, a high degree of excellence in writing was achieved. Writing became firmly established. In al-Kufa and al-Basra, it reached a great degree of accuracy, but did not reach the limit of perfection. The Kufic script is still known at this time. The Arabs then spread over all the regions and provinces and conquered Afriqiya and Spain. The Abbasids founded Baghdad. There, the different kinds of writing reached the limit of perfection, because civilization was highly developed in Baghdad, since it had become the home of Islam and the center of the Arab dynasty. The 180 norms of writing used in Baghdad were different from those in Al-Kufa, in that they inclined toward well-shaped letters, brilliancy, and splendor. This difference became established, and lasted, for a long time. The Wazir, Abba, Ali b. Mughal 181 became its protagonist in Baghdad. He was followed in this respect by the secretary, Ali b. Hilal, who is known as Ibn al-Bawab 182. The tradition of instruction in the Baghdadi and Kufi writing ended with him in the 4th–10th century 183 and afterwards. The forms and the norms of the Baghdadi script then departed still further from Kufic, and eventually, there was a complete break. Later on, the differences were accentuated by masters who always tried to find new forms and improved norms of writing, up to the time of such later calligraphers as Yaqut al-Mustasimi 184 and al-Wal Ali al-Ajami 185. The tradition of the teaching of writing stopped with them. This type of calligraphy was transferred to Egypt, where the script was somewhat different from the Iraqi script. The non-Arabs learned the Iraqi script there, in the Iraq. It turned out to be different or completely distinct from the writing of the Egyptians. The Afriqi script, the old form of which is, still, known at this time, was close to the forms of the Eastern script. Spain became the domain of the Umayyads. Their situation as to sedentary culture, the crafts, and the various scripts was a special one. As a result, the Spanish script, as it is known at the present time, became special, too. Civilization and sedentary culture developed greatly everywhere in the various Muslim dynasties. Royal authority increased, and the sciences were cultivated. Books were copied, and they were well written and bound. Castles and royal libraries were filled with them in an incomparable way. The inhabitants of the different regions vied with and rivaled each other in this respect. Then, the Muslim Empire became disorganized and shrank. With its shrinking, all these things shrank, too. With the disappearance of the Caliphate, Baghdad lost its outstanding position. The position it had held with regard to calligraphy and the art of writing, and, indeed, with regard to scholarship, in general, was taken over by Egypt and Cairo. The art of writing continues to be cultivated there at this time. There are teachers of writing there who are employed, just, to teach the letters. For that, they have norms of how the letters are to be drawn and shaped. These norms are generally recognized among them. The student soon learns to draw and form the letters well, as he learns them by sensual perception. 186 becomes skilled in them through practice in writing them, and learns them in the form of scientific norms. Therefore, his letters turn out to be as well formed as possible. The inhabitants of Spain, on the other hand, were dispersed throughout the various regions when the rule of the Arabs in Spain and that of the Berbers who succeeded, the Arabs, were annihilated and the Christian nations gained the upper hand. From the time of the Lamtuna, Almoravid dynasty down to this time, they have spread all over the coast of the Maghrib and Afriqiya. They permitted the people settled there to share in the crafts they possessed, and they attached themselves to the ruling dynasty in northwest Africa. In this way, their script replaced the Afriqi script and wiped it out. The scripts of Al-Qayrawan and Al-Madiyya were forgotten, once the customs and crafts of the two cities were forgotten. All the various scripts of the inhabitants of Afriqiya were assimilated to the Spanish script used in Tunis and adjacent regions, because there were so many Spaniards there after the exodus from eastern Spain. 187 The old script has been preserved in the Jarid, where people had no contact with those who wrote the Spanish script and were not in close touch with them, because the Spaniards who came to northwest Africa used to proceed 188 to the capital city of Tunis. The script of the inhabitants of Afriqiya thus became a representative 189 of the Spanish type of writing. Eventually, the shadow of the Almohad dynasty receded somewhat, and sedentary culture and luxury retrogressed with the retrogression of civilization. At that time, writing also suffered a setback, and its forms deteriorated. The method of teaching writing was no longer known, in consequence of the general corruption of sedentary culture and the decrease in civilization. Traces of the Spanish script remain there. They attest to the perfection in it, which the people had formerly possessed. The existence of such traces is explained by the fact that, as we have mentioned before, 190 it is difficult to wipe out the crafts once they are firmly established in a sedentary culture. In the later Marinid dynasty in Morocco, a kind of Spanish script established itself, because the Spaniards were close neighbors and the Spaniards, who left Spain, soon settled in Fez, and the Marianides employed them during all the days of their rule. But, in regions far from the seat and capital of the realm, writing was not cared for, and it was forgotten as if it had never been known. The various types of script used in Afriqiya and the two Maghribs inclined to be ugly and far from excellent. When books were copied, it was useless to look at them critically. Study of them merely caused pain and trouble, because the texts were very corrupt and full of clerical errors, and the letters were no longer well formed. Thus, they could be read only with some difficulty. In this way, writing was affected like all the other crafts by the decrease of sedentary culture and the corruption of the ruling dynasties. God decides and no one can change his decision. 191. Professor 192 Abu 1 Hassan Ali B. Hilal al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, who is known as Ibn al-Bawab, 193 wrote a poem in the Basit meter 194 with the rhyme on R, in which he mentions the craft of writing and the matters with which it has to do. The poem belongs among the best things ever written on the subject. I considered it proper to insert it in this chapter, so that those who want to learn the craft of writing may profit from it. It begins. O you who want to write a calligraphic hand, and desire to write and draw the letters, well, if you are truly desirous of mastering the art of writing, pray that your master make it easy for you. Prepare a calamus that is straight and strong, capable of fashioning elegant writing with craft. If you propose to nib the calamus, aim at applying to it the greatest symmetry. Look at both ends of it, and then nib it. At the end where it is thin and narrow, give the part of the calamus that is nibbed a moderate size, neither too long nor too short, and make the split precisely in the middle of the calamus so that the space nibbed on both sides of it will be exactly equal. Eventually, when you have done all this as carefully as the careful craftsman who knows what is wanted, then, turn all your attention toward cutting the point, for cutting the point is the crux of the procedure. Do not beg me to reveal its secret. I am chary of its secret, a thing concealed. But the sum total of what I want to say is that the point should be something between oblique and round. Stir the ink in the inkstand with soot that is treated with vinegar or verjuice. Add to it red pigment that has been diluted with orpiment and camphor. Eventually, when the ink has fermented, go to the clean, pleasant, tested paper. After cutting it, press it with a press, so as to remove all trace of crumpling and soiling. 195 Then, make patient imitation your habit. Only a patient person achieves what he desires. Begin by writing on a wooden slate, wearing it out. 196 With a resolution kept free from haste. Do not be ashamed of your bad writing. When you begin to imitate the letters and draw lines, the matter is difficult at the beginning, and then becomes easy. Many a thing that is difficult at the beginning turns out later on to be easy. Eventually, when you have achieved what you have hoped for, you will be filled with 197 joy and gladness. Then, thank your God and do His pleasure. God loves all those who are grateful. Furthermore, pray that the fingers of your hand will write only what is good for you to leave behind in the house of deception. 198. Everything a man does, he will be confronted with on the morrow. When he is confronted with the written decree, on the day of resurrection. It should be known that writing shows the things that are spoken, just as the things that are spoken show the ideas that are in the soul and the mind. Both writing and speech must express clearly what they want to express. God said, He created man, taught him clarity. 199. This includes clarity in all the things one expresses. The perfection of good handwriting consists in the fact that it is clear. This is achieved by indicating clearly the conventional 200 letters of the script, arranging and drawing them well. Each letter by itself is distinct from the others, except where connection between the letters within a word is an accepted technicality. This does not apply to letters that have been accepted as letters that should remain unconnected, such as when it precedes another letter in the word, nor to R, Z, D, DH, and others. It is different when these letters follow another letter in a word. It is this way with all letters. Later scribes then agreed to connect words with each other and omit letters. 201 that were known to them but not to others who did not know the code, which, thus, remained unclear to others. These scribes are the officials who write government documents and keep court records. It seems that they use such a special code, from which others are excluded, because they have to write a great deal, and they are famous for their writing, and many people connected with them 202 know their code. When they write to others who do not know their code, they cannot use it and have to try to write as clearly as possible. Otherwise, their writing would be like non-Arabic writing. It would be in the same category with it in as much as both types of writing, the code and non-Arabic writing, are not, generally, agreed upon by conventional usage. There is no real excuse for writing in code, except in the case of officials of the government's tax and army bureaus. They are required to conceal their affairs from the people, since these affairs are government secrets that have to be kept secret. Therefore, they use a very special code among themselves, which is like a puzzle. It makes use of the names of perfumes, fruits, birds, or flowers to indicate the letters, or it makes use of forms different from the accepted forms of the letters. Such a code is agreed upon by the correspondents between themselves, in order to be able to convey their thoughts in writing. Occasionally, skillful secretaries, though not the first to invent a certain code, and with no previous knowledge of it, nonetheless find rules for deciphering it, through combinations which they evolve for the purpose with the help of their intelligence. 203 and which they call solving the puzzle, decoding. Well-known writings on the subject are in the possession of the people. God is knowing and wise. 30. The craft of book production. Formerly, people were concerned with scholarly writings and official records. These were copied, bound, and corrected with the help of a transmission technique 204 and with accuracy. The reason for this was the importance of the ruling dynasty and the existence of the things that depend on sedentary culture. All that has disappeared at the present time as the result of the disappearance of the dynasties and the decrease of civilization. In Islam it had formerly reached tremendous proportions in the Iraq and in Spain. All of it depends on civilization, on the extent of the ruling dynasties, and on the demand existing in the dynasties, 205 for it. Thus, scholarly works and writings were, formerly, numerous. People were desirous of transmitting them everywhere and at any time. They were copied and bound. The craft of book producers, thus, made its appearance. They are the craftsmen, concerned with copying, correcting, and binding books, and with all the other matters pertaining to books and writings. The craft of book production was restricted to cities of a large civilization. Originally, copies of scholarly works, government correspondence, letters of enfeoffment, and diplomas 206 were written on parchment especially prepared from animal skins by craftsmen, because there was great prosperity at the beginning of Islam and the works that were written were few. As we shall mention. 207 In addition, government documents and diplomas were few in number. Therefore, the early Muslims restricted themselves to writing on parchment. This was an expression of respect for what was to be written down, and of desire that it should be correct and accurate. The production of books and writings then developed greatly. Government documents and diplomas increased in number. There was not enough parchment for all that. Therefore, Al-Fadl b. Yahya 208 suggested the manufacture of paper. Thus, paper was used for government documents and diplomas. Afterwards, people used paper in sheets for government and scholarly writings, and the manufacture of paper reached a considerable degree of excellence. The concern of scholars and the interest of government people then concentrated on accuracy in scholarly writings and the establishment of their correctness with the help of a chain of transmitters leading back to their writers and authors. Because that is the most important element in establishing a correct and accurate text. Statements are thus led back to those who made them, and decisions, in legal questions, fatwa, are led back to the persons who decided in accordance with them and were able to pronounce them by means of independent judgment. Wherever the correctness of a text is not established by a chain of transmitters going back to the person who wrote that particular text, the statement or decision in question cannot properly be ascribed to its alleged author. This has been the procedure of scholars and experts in all matters of religious knowledge, in all times, races, and regions, so much so that the usefulness of the craft connected with the transmission of traditions came to be restricted to this aspect of the process of transmission. The main fruit of the craft concerned with the transmission of traditions is the knowledge of which traditions are sound, which are good, which go back in an uninterrupted chain of transmitters to the Prophet, Musnad, which have a chain of transmitters that skips the first transmitter on the authority of Muhammad, Mursal, which have a chain that stops with one of the men of the second generation, Magdu, and which have a chain that stops with one of the men around Muhammad, Maqaf. In order to be able to distinguish such traditions from spurious ones 209, this is no longer a subject of investigation. The cream of it has been churned in the principal collections of traditions that have found general acceptance by all Muslims. It would, thus, be a superfluous activity to attempt to investigate the matter anew. Therefore, the only remaining result to be gained from the process of transmission and occupation with it is that it can serve to establish a correct text of the principal collections of traditions and other books on jurisprudence used for legal decisions, 210, as well as for other writings and scholarly works. It also serves to establish uninterrupted connection with their respective authors, so that transmission on their authority or ascription to them is sound. Both in the East and in Spain, this method has been the tried and true path. We find that the copies made in former times in those regions are the most exact, well done, and correct. People everywhere at this time possess old copies attesting to the perfection previously reached in this respect. The inhabitants of the various regions have handed them down, and preserved them to the present, and they do not like to part with them. At the present time, this method has altogether disappeared in the Maghrib and among Maghribis, because the craft of writing, accuracy, and the transmission technique were cut off there as the result of the destruction of the civilization of the Maghrib, and its basic 211 desert attitude. The principal collections and writings were copied in Bedouin script. They were copied by Berber students in such a bad handwriting and with so much corruption and so many clerical errors that they cannot be understood. They remain incomprehensible to those who examine them critically. Only very rarely are they of any use. Furthermore, this situation has caused disintegration in the field of legal decisions, fatwa. Most statements ascribed to the school authorities are not, orally, transmitted but are taken from the writings as they are found there. This has also affected the attempts of some religious leaders to write books. They know little of the technical side of authorship, and lack the crafts necessary for realizing the purposes of authorship. Some slight remnant of this institution has remained in Spain. It is about to disappear. Religious scholarship has almost completely stopped in the Maghrib. God has the power to execute His commands. 212. We now hear that the craft of transmission, technique, still exists in the East. The sciences and crafts are in demand there, as we shall mention later on, 213, and, therefore, those who want to, find it easy to establish the correct text of writings. However, the script for good copying surviving there is that of the non-Arabs, and found in their manuscripts. The copying of books has deteriorated in Egypt as it has in the Maghrib, and even more so. God has the power to execute His commands.